Hey everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We'll just give everyone a second to join and get started in just a minute. Thanks for hanging in there. Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on our Barriers to Fair Access report. I'm Sarah Emond, the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of ICER. It's my pleasure to be the host of today's webinar. We're going to go through the results of what we found in this year's Barriers to Fair Access report. We're going to spend most of our time hearing from the patient communities that are impacted by these coverage policies directly. So I'm thrilled to be joined by Mary Dwight, the Senior Vice President and Chief Policy and Advocacy Officer at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and Meghan Buzby, the Executive Director of CHAMP, the Coalition for Headache and Migraine Patients, who will join me in just a little bit. So let me share with you what we found this year. But before I do that, for those who don't know, ICER is an independent nonprofit HTA, Health Technology Assessment Group, founded in 2006. Our goal is to use evidence in a transparent way to align prices with the benefits that patients and families receive from those therapies. And the whole point of doing this is to prove both access and affordability while retaining the incentives that we need for future innovation. And a lot of you might know us for the work that we do assessing the price of new drugs. Well, part of being committed to a grand bargain of fair price and fair access is not just assessing the prices that we are paying for those healthcare interventions, but it's also shining a light on the coverage policies that payers and pharmacy benefit managers use to make sure that patients get access. So part of that grand bargain means shining a light on those policies, and that's the point of our Barriers to Fair Access report. None of this work would have been possible without the tremendous effort of the ICER team listed here. This is both current and former employees who participated in producing this year's report. My thanks goes to all of them for the contributions that they made. I also want to make note of the tremendous input that we got from our Barriers to Fair Access working group, the members of which are listed in our protocol, linked below the asterisks. And finally, a big shout out to MMIT Analytics. Their market access database was the source of a lot of the information that we used. They are an industry leading source of that information on coverage policies that allowed us to do this analysis. All right, so where did this idea come from? What is the background of this fair access work? Well, it really came from one of our policy leadership forum discussions. So our policy leadership forum are leading life sciences, health plan, and PBM groups. We also had clinical societies and patients at that meeting where we tried to come to some understanding of what fair access looks like if you're adjudicating a coverage policy. So these fair access criteria, these ethical considerations for what fair access looks like, culminated in a paper in 2020. When we did this paper, a few of us had a little inkling that we could probably do more than just write down the way the coverage policies should look. What would happen if we tried to assess how coverage policies actually look applying these criteria? And the whole point of both the paper and the white paper and the report that we now do annually is to really serve as that starting point for a dialogue of how we can get patients better access. How are we achieving fair access as a health system? So what did we do this year? We looked at the 15 largest commercial formularies. What we did was we picked the largest for the biggest companies. We only would do one per company. So if CVS had a second formulary that was actually the second largest in the country, it didn't matter. We moved on to the next company so that we were looking at more companies than just those with the biggest formularies. We added two of the largest Affordable Care Act exchange plans this year, representing California and Florida. And we leveraged that MMIT database that I mentioned to look at both the tiering and the prior authorization documentation. And when we needed additional information or had some questions, we reached out directly to the payers in scope and offered them the opportunity to provide that information directly to us. What's different about this year versus the report we did last year is something that we'll be implementing moving forward. We went back and looked at all of the drugs that we reviewed 2 years ago. Remember, this was 2022 when we were doing it. So these were the drugs we reviewed in 2020. We identified 19 drugs across 5 therapeutic areas that were subsequently approved by the FDA, meaning there should be coverage policies out there that would give us a chance to assess how the fair access to these drugs is going 2 years after an ICER review. New this year was also adding in reviewing the formulary of the Veterans Health Administration. So in addition to commercial payers, we wanted to get some exposure to what is happening in the public market as well. The other thing that we did this year was based on feedback from our working group. We wanted to go beyond the things that are sort of easier to measure in the documentation, and we'll get into what those are, our 4 criteria. But we wanted to look at things that patients and clinicians experience more acutely. So we have an exploratory analysis where we did 2 things. We wanted to look at the relative burden of prior authorization forms. And as a rough surrogate of that, we counted the number of questions on the form, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The other thing we wanted to do was find out how hard or how easy it would be to get information on whether or not a drug that you're currently taking was covered by a new health plan that you might be thinking of joining, and would you be eligible based on your clinical history, and what would your cost sharing be? So we acted like a consumer and Googled it. Can I go find out how I could get access to this, what kind of access I would have to this drug, and how much it would cost me? So that was the exploratory analysis that's new this year. What we did on our primary analysis is evaluate the prior authorization and utilization management criteria for the 19 drugs across cost sharing, clinical eligibility, step therapy, and provider qualifications. The reason we chose those categories is because those are things that you can easily adjudicate by reading the actual utilization management policy. In case of cost sharing, we used tiering, which tier the drug appeared on in the formulary, as a rough surrogate for cost sharing, with the notable caveat that it is, of course, variable. One formulary might have a series of different cost sharings for the different tiers, because cost sharing is often the choice of the plan sponsor. So we know that tiering is a rough surrogate, but it's the best one we have. And to round out what we did with what we could find in the data and through our exploratory analyses on transparency, we supplemented what we know patients experience, which is sort of beyond what the paperwork looks like. So we invited all of the patient groups that had engaged with us for all of the therapeutic areas during the reviews in 2020 to provide data and anecdotes and experiences of patients trying to get access to these particular drugs. So that section also appears in the report. Okay, what did we find? Not too different than our report from 2021. We found that across the board, there is pretty good concordance, meaning the criteria used in these coverage policies matches our fair access criteria in the 4 different domains, with the domain of cost sharing being the place where we see the most non-concordance, meaning not meeting our criteria. An important caveat that we'll talk about a little bit more as well as we get later on in the presentation is the cost sharing is only applied to the 6 drugs out of the 19 in our analysis that we deemed cost effective. Part of our fair access criteria is that the cost sharing criteria, which states the drug needs to be on the lowest relevant tier, meaning often preferred brand, only applies if the drug is deemed cost effective. So only 6 of the drugs in our analysis met that criteria. So those numbers are only for 6 drugs. That's why you see that denominator lower, because there's 6 drugs across the 18 different payers that we looked at. But you see 100% concordance on prescriber restrictions, and you see very high concordance on step therapy and clinical eligibility criteria. Okay, so that's the overall numbers. Well, what else did we find? We found that in step therapy, there's some examples that are worth highlighting. So this is just 3 of the drugs that we looked at. These are 3 drugs for acute migraine, just as an illustration of how step therapy policies are getting adjudicated by us in terms of their fair access criteria. One thing that we had done last year is when we looked at step therapy, we were looking at, did it meet sort of the clinical guidelines for, yes, it's okay to have someone try an equally effective but less expensive therapy before you allow access to a more expensive therapy with similar effectiveness. What we failed to do in our first round was say, well, how many steps is fair? And that's a change we made this year based on some academic research and some evidence on what constitutes a reasonable number of steps. We capped the number of steps at 3. So you can see here that across several of the different payers, we have those in the Ravoy line, you can see here, the range was for 0 to 4. Some didn't require any steps to get access to the drug, but 3 plans actually required 4. So in that case, those 4 plans would have been judged as non-concordant with our fair access criteria for requiring 4 steps before you could get access to that therapy. And I picked one drug from each of the 5 therapeutic areas just to drill down a little bit about how drug by drug, things might look a little different than those overall concordance numbers that we were looking at a few slides ago. And where you'll see the most variation, again, is in cost sharing. So there's 2 cells here that say NA because these are 2 drugs not deemed cost effective from our analysis, so we did not apply the cost sharing analysis to them. But when we looked at Hemlibra for hemophilia A and Flectra for ulcerative colitis and Nurtec for acute migraine, you can see there's a variation in how many payers were giving fair access from a cost sharing perspective to these therapies. But across the board, you see that, again, provider restrictions were 100% concordant. We had several 100% in step therapy, and then a little more variation in clinical eligibility. So just an example of how drilling down a little bit on a drug by drug basis and illuminates some of the differences that you might miss by just looking at the overall concordance numbers. I'll also highlight Hemlibra here. Really interesting case of a drug that we actually deemed more effective and less expensive than the standard of treatment. Something that is a finding we don't often get when we're introducing new therapies into the healthcare system. And you see pretty low concordance rates in clinical eligibility in step therapy. And it's because we think that this is a pretty expensive drug on its face, even though it's displacing already expensive therapy. And so there's a lot of work to do to highlight that even when something might seem expensive on paper, if our analysis shows it's either cost effective or cost saving, there's an obligation on the payer side to make sure that the access criteria follow rewarding prices chosen in line with the benefits that patients receive. A very busy slide. Don't panic. Just take a look at the cost sharing. Just wanted to highlight again, now we've gone from looking at it on a drug by drug basis, but we're looking at it on a formulary by formulary basis. You can see, again, a wide variation when it comes from the cost sharing. And again, you can look at all the way over to provider restrictions. We've seen that 100% concordance. We see step therapy, a lot of concordance there from several of these companies. But the cost sharing is where we see a lot of variation. And one of the things that really is interesting and that we've had a lot of discussions with the payers about and understanding the context around this is the functional difference between a tier 3 and a tier 4 formulary. It's something that I've learned more about doing this project that's really interesting, and I wanted to share with all of you today. A lot of us are familiar with the 3-tier, right? That's one of the most common. You can see that here of the most of the formularies with the most covered lives in the US. We have most of them in that tier 3 bucket. Tier 1 is usually generic, tier 2 is preferred brand, and tier 3 is non-preferred brand. Well, it makes a lot of sense in our cost sharing. When we apply our cost sharing criteria, if it's a fairly priced drug, we say it needs to be in the lowest relevant tier, meaning tier 2 in a 3-tier formulary. And in most cases, not all, the plans were kind of on board with that approach. Where things got really interesting was adjudicating the 4-tier formularies. And what we heard from some of the payers from that space is that they put every specialty drug on tier 4, no matter if it's fairly priced or not. There's no putting it on tier 2 preferred brand. That's only for their small molecule drugs. It's just a structural way they do this. The thing that was really interesting, and I don't have a lot of data to back this up, this is what we heard from talking to the payers, is that a lot of the plan sponsors then choose a cost sharing structure so that the tier 4 cost sharing actually matches the tier 2 cost sharing. Can't say that that happens. We know that doesn't happen uniformly. We know that often tier 4 is associated with a high coinsurance in some plan designs. But I learned a lot talking to the payers about how there's some nuance here, that they could actually have a structural 4-tier formulary, put everything that's specialty on that tier 4, but the cost sharing is actually comparable to a different tier, like tier 2. I will highlight, many of you know that ICER has worked with the VA over the years, counseling them on how to use ICER's research to support better pricing and access for veterans. And they actually were very excited to be included in the analysis this year. And just an example of the tiering structure there, we do have them listed as 6, actually they have 1 tier. So there was the 6 drugs that were assessed for this analysis. If we're cost sharing are included in that numerator and denominator, the VA offers a flat copay for every drug that it offers and does not actually use a tiering system. Another very interesting finding from our review. Moving on to the exploratory analyses we did. We took a look at 2 drugs for migraine and 2 drugs for ulcerative colitis. And we wanted to simulate the experience of somebody shopping for health insurance. So this means you don't have access to the portal, you don't have a username and a login, but you're thinking maybe next year I might want to switch from Anthem to Aetna. Okay, fine. What would happen to your cost sharing, and would your drug be covered with your current condition? And what we found was 88% of payers had the prescription list, the drug list available for the respective formularies. So we were able to see if the drug was included and on what tier. We found that only 64% of the health insurers provided transparency into the prior authorization policies, meaning would I meet the clinical eligibility criteria to get access to this drug? And we saw that 80% of PBMs actually do not provide any publicly available information on their coverage policies under their own name. And this we think is something structural about the relationship between PBMs and payers. And often the information for a particular payer would go through to the, that would be adjudicated on the PBM side, would be branded as the payer's portal and not necessarily the the formulary that CVS was offering that payer. And so it makes sense that some of that information was hard to find, but it was another interesting finding of our transparency analysis. And the other thing that we looked at was prior authorization burden. We're all familiar with the information that the American Medical Association and other physician groups have put forth about the amount of staff time that's now required to do the paperwork for getting access to some of these therapies. We talked a lot about how to do this, and what we decided to do was just looking at a sample of 11 drugs, again, in migraine and UC, we just wanted to get a sense of how many questions were on the form. So another imperfect surrogate for burden, for a couple of reasons that we learned when we looked at the analysis. But just to report out that for the migraine drugs, the range of questions was pretty wide, from 25 to 56 questions required. And the range for UC was even wider, 22 to 71 questions. Another thing we learned doing the analysis and talking to the payers is that some of these forms are now moving to electronic prior auth. And some of those systems will automatically populate answers to many of these questions. The patient demographic information might already be filled out once you go into the portal for a particular patient. So that's encouraging that there's efforts to be made to make these prior auth forms easier to fill out. But important to highlight the burden that this continues to place on physicians and their offices, as well as the impact on patients who might have a delay in accessing their care because of the amount of paperwork that's required in order to get an approval for accessing the drug. Just like last year, when we shared our draft results with the payers in scope, we were able to, they were able to tell us if they were going to, and then subsequently did, change any of their policies in order to change their rating from non-concordant to concordant. And just like in our prior year study, this time we had 5 payers change policies for 11 different drugs to bring those policies in line with being fair access for patients. And what this shows us is that there's an opportunity for the transparency into this part of the grand bargain, the fair access part, leading to better access for patients. So while a lot of the changes were on tier placement for those drugs that we deemed cost effective to be on the lowest relevant tier, we did also see changes across clinical eligibility. And here's just a few of the examples we saw. Oxbryta for sickle cell disease. One of the payers had clinical eligibility that did not match the FDA label, and they changed it and lowered it to patients ages 4 and older. One payer, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, changed the number of previous therapies required before getting access to 8 different ulcerative colitis drugs. Blue Shield of California moved a migraine drug to the preferred brand tier in order to then pass cost-sharing concordance. And Hemlibra was moved to the preferred brand tier by 2 different payers, again, to move that into a concordant cost-sharing adjudication. One of the things that I'm most proud of in doing this work, and that I can probably say for that whole team you saw on the earlier side, is we're proud of being able to bring some transparency to the way that these coverage policies are written and applied in service to getting better access for patients. There are some key limitations to our work that I wanted to make sure that we were very upfront about. While we looked at 4 different categories of fair access and did some transparency around prior authorization burden and transparency of information for prospective plan members, there are a number of fair access criteria in our original white paper that are almost impossible for us to adjudicate. And so it is with caution that anyone should draw a conclusion from our work that payers are doing a great job on fair access criteria, because it's only a subset of the criteria that we're able to look at. And there are things like the appropriate implementation of these policies. It's possible that we would pass a policy as being concordant for clinical eligibility or provider restrictions, but the actual experience of clinicians and patients might not feel anything like what's written on paper. And we can't look at that through this type of analysis. And as I referenced earlier, we're the first ones to say that tiering is a very rough surrogate for cost sharing experienced by patients. We know that the choice of actual copay and coinsurance amounts by plan sponsors themselves has an incredible impact on how patients experience that tiering and that cost sharing. The other interesting caveat we would offer is that when we did the analysis to see which drugs should go through the cost sharing analysis, again, we say that's only for drugs ICER is deemed cost effective. Well, in order to say which drugs now are cost effective, we used average net prices across all payers in order to decide which of those drugs, and it was 6 that we deemed should be part of that analysis. That may not be reflective of one particular payer's price that they're paying. But we went forward with those 6, but did hear from some payers that they weren't getting the average net price that we were offering. And so then theoretically, the cost sharing criteria wouldn't necessarily apply to them. What we decided to do was apply it across the board with a notation that this is an average and it is a limitation of using the average price across all payers to judge the cost sharing criteria. And it's always possible, given that we looked at only one formulary per payer, and we also focused on the largest payers in the country, that these formularies could provide superior or even inferior coverage than formularies covering fewer individuals offered by the same payers or formularies offered by smaller payers. So another important caveat when drawing conclusions from our analysis. So before we go to questions, just in summary, among the criteria we were able to assess, most payers are abiding by the fair access criteria that we've outlined, with the notable exception of the variation we see in cost sharing. And the changes that we saw in the coverage policies and when the payers were able to look at the draft mirror what we saw when we did our first analysis in 2021. And it shows us that payers are, at least some of them, responsive to feedback on how they can improve their coverage policies in the spirit of fair access. And just to preview, the work is already underway for the report that we'll issue this year that will look at the drugs that we reviewed in 2021, covering such areas such as high cholesterol, lupus nephritis, and myasthenia gravis. All right, so now I'm going to invite Megan and Mary to come off camera, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and now we're going to have a conversation. And the point of bringing Mary and Megan, not only because I was looking forward to spending time with them today, was because there's so much beyond this analysis that patients experience that's really difficult to see when you're reading a prior auth form or counting the number of steps. And we're thrilled that both of their organizations contributed to the report itself with some data and the experiences of the patients that they have, but that they're here today to share some of that. So Mary, I'm going to turn to you first. And I would love for you to share a little bit with the audience about what we can't see in this analysis. What are the patients in your community experiencing when it comes to trying to access their drugs that might not be reflected in what we saw today in the results?
Thanks, Sarah. Well, first of all, thanks for having us, and thank you also for this report. As you noted, it's such a critical component of the grand bargain to look at how coverage actually occurs and how somebody actually accesses these important therapies. So I think this report does a really important job of starting the conversation around access. However, as you just noted at the tail end of your presentation about the limitations of what you're able to see, for people with cystic fibrosis, a lot of times the full picture of access and affordability is really hard to measure. I think perhaps not surprisingly, but quite evident from the report is just how complicated and opaque coverage is for some of these therapies. And I think particularly what you and people with cystic fibrosis, what we see are still not able to see when evaluating if the coverage available for them will meet their clinical needs affordably, is that significant challenges continue to exist that weren't really even available, and when we look at a plan for someone, are very difficult to assess and even view. One thing I think particularly concerning right now for us in terms of opacity of plans is newer programs from health insurance like accumulators, which I hope we are going to be able to talk about a little bit later in our conversation. And I think the other thing that you again acknowledged as you look at these large payers, some of the things that we're seeing particularly concerning to us is coverage issues not included in this report outside of this large group, large insurers, and particularly around self-funded insurance plans. or plans that have smaller number of covered lives. You mentioned that a key limitation in the report is that the formularies you selected to evaluate are those with large amounts of coverage lives. And with these smaller plans, we see a lot of things around very high cost sharing, again, accumulator programs, which again, hopefully we can talk about in a second, and even exclusion of some of our key CF therapies, the modulators, which was included in your report, from the formularies. So these smaller plans and these self-funded plans don't have to abide by state insurance laws. So people experience these challenges even in states that are trying to tighten restrictions and requirements for good coverage. So those are just a few things that we're seeing in CF, or particularly around some of our higher priced therapies, including the modulators, which was included in the report.
Thanks, Mary. Two important points there that I wanted to just amplify before we turn to Meghan. We're looking at in our reviews at one drug for a particular condition. And for many of these patients, that's only one drug that they're taking. And maybe there's great access for one of the modulators, but that doesn't mean that they're having, they're not having trouble getting access to all of the other medicines that they need to manage their condition. And that cumulative burden for people with chronic conditions can get lost when we focus only on one treatment for one condition. So thank you for highlighting that.
Sarah, can I just build on that?
Of course, please.
Certainly, drugs is what we're talking about today. But I think really for many chronic illnesses, it's the totality of care that's required. So we have drugs on one side, but then you also have specialized care from multiple specialists. And really, again, the totality, you hit the nail on the head. When you add up all of those factors, a copay for every therapy, a copay for every visit, every specialist, and navigating through that morass is really where we really see barriers and ultimately delays or skipping care altogether because the affordability is just too much. So I think that's a critical point. Thank you.
Thank you. No, Mary, thanks for that. The other thing that you mentioned that was important for me to amplify was the exemption that self-funded employers have. And then sometimes the behavior of some of the smaller plans that are trying to offer competitive rates to clients and in terms of their drug benefit. We are hearing what is sort of keeping the employers up at night. Right. And we're hearing that the rising cost of prescription drugs is one of them. And I'm disappointed when I hear things like, well, we're thinking of excluding entire categories of medicines in order to save money. And I just want to highlight this is a symptom of a problem. Right. In our prep call, we were talking about a game of whack-a-mole. I hope I'm not taking that away from either of you. You're going to mention it later. And we were thinking about how the root cause, the rising cost of health insurance and the rising cost of care, we have things like accumulators popping up. We have self-funded employers who think maybe I won't cover any cell or gene therapies. That's really a tragedy for a health system that wants to improve health for everyone. And we have to remember there's symptoms of problems that we can address by really trying to get at this fair access and fair price grand bargain. All right, Meghan. What is your community experiencing that we can't really see in this analysis?
Well, first, thank you for having me today on the webinar and for including the community in reviewing this report and providing, things. I'm really excited that you guys have undertaken this important work. And just as Mary said, start of this conversation, I wish I had a lot more time to get into everything that our community, is faced with that couldn't be covered in this report. But just a couple of things, certainly piggybacking on what Mary and you were saying about the totality of care is really important for those living with migraine, because migraine is an extremely comorbid condition of a lot of other conditions that are chronic. And so very much that totality, holistic approach, we hear time and time again from patients that, no one's really looking at them holistically. They're going again to that specialized care. They've got multiple specialized, specialists in their care, in their management. So it's that is really hard and difficult. And then I would say probably one of the hardest things with migraine is it's such a wide spectrum of a disease that, you know, from the patient community perspective, we really do try to push this, you know, the thought around the toolbox, which I think a lot of patient communities do, right? Like we need everything available in the toolbox for patients because, you know, not only will not everything work, you know, for everyone, it's super individualized. And so not everything is going to always work for everyone, unfortunately, as in they could go on a therapy, have it be effective, and then have it stop working, you know, 3 months down the road. And so they really need that access. And we've seen a lot of barriers to that access, not just at the payer level, I would say either. I mean, I think there's a lot of stakeholders involved. This is like a multifaceted healthcare system problem, right? That we're trying to unravel. And so there's a lot of different ways that they're having to face barriers, but certainly that having access to all the tools in the toolbox. And I know that this report really only focused on acute treatments, but there are preventive treatments. And a lot of times, you know, you're going to need a preventive and an acute treatment. So, you know, having the access to all of them is just so incredibly important. And unfortunately, we're just not seeing that, you know, optimal care and management of the disease.
I appreciate that. It's another point on the tension, right? That just like exists between a payer making a decision based on one particular drug for one particular population right in front of them. And that's their job, right? Like that's what they're doing. And then the fact that that patient has another whole other lived experience with that health insurer and that healthcare system that needs to be taken into account. And so one of the aspects of our fair access criteria is a transparent and quick appeals process, right? Because there's very few patients who fit into that average bucket that will apply beautifully to the policies they've written it. And it's one thing that is difficult to know how payers are doing without going and doing a site visit, but I think it's something we can call on the payer community to continue to boast about if they're good at, right? We want plans, or we want self-funded and plan sponsors maybe to be picking plans based on that, because we want to make sure that there is a pathway for that adjudication, for that appeal, so that there aren't delays in care. So thank you, Megan, for that. So in the same vein, beyond what we've been able to talk about and look at, and we did a very cursory transparency analysis, just looking at, could we know what tier it was on? Could we see the prior auth criteria? What additional information do we want to call on payers for making available so that patients can make the best informed decision they can when thinking about choosing a health insurance product? Mary, I'll start with you.
Okay, well, I got two. And the first thing is a really a systematic whole hog request. I think we really need to rethink plan design for chronic illness. And we also need a lot more transparency. You guys were looking under the hood a little bit, but as we've noted already multiple times on this webinar, you don't get a full perspective. Okay, so let me start with the beginning. One size fits all for chronic care does not work anymore. How we pay for and manage healthcare costs really, when we think about chronic illnesses like the ones we're evaluating here, what's happening far too often is, in our case, the person with cystic fibrosis is the one carrying the heaviest burden in the current system. So we really applaud the report that examines whether an individual can access vital drugs at an affordable price to them, which, as we've noted already, includes not only affordability for that specific drug, like copay or other cost-sharing obligations, but also the cost of their health insurance overall. And what I mean by that is the type of plan that they require for their illness affordable to them. And what we're seeing particularly is that increasingly the type of insurance plan that provides coverage, even networks, for the specialty care and the therapies that are required for chronic illness are increasingly more and more expensive for an individual. So there are trade-offs that they're having to make. And of course, that component doesn't even begin to include all the other life expenses that come with having a chronic illness. Those are very rarely factored into by either the health insurer or other payers, and certainly not the drug manufacturers either. So I really applaud the question the report poses. Is it fair to have patients pay the highest cost sharing level, for example, when there's only a single drug available in the class? Is it fair to have the patient having to pay the most for even to begin to get the care that they need? And then my second recommendation, Sarah, you've already said multiple times, Megan has said this too, far greater transparency throughout the process from both insurers and manufacturers. I think you're starting to look under the hood again of those complex prior authorization forms, the lack of transparency from payers that can delay access to care and add to that administrative burden, certainly for first and foremost a person with cystic fibrosis, but also their care teams. You mentioned the AMA has been speaking about this a lot. It's significant, and we hear from some members of the care team it's over half of their time. We know other folks are hiring people for the month of January just to churn through all the new year prior authorizations. We've seen examples of cystic fibrosis modulators have prior authorizations approvals for less than 1 year, which is really just ridiculous, given this is a chronic medication for a disease that somebody has had since birth and will have for their lifetime. Why do we need to have the administrative burden of something like that? And those short-term approvals require proof of clinical benefit to reapprove, maintenance of current health status through modulator use, all of these hoops and steps and jumps and time. And then I think there are also challenges outside of that coverage criteria resulting in back barriers. We hear of challenges with families navigating specialty pharmacies, a difficult understanding which pharmacy they should use with their insurance plans. Many times we have patients who have to use multiple pharmacies because of the individual deals each manufacturer has for their specialty tiers. Every one of these adds time and burden, and unfortunately too often cost to a person with cystic fibrosis. And when those burdens are increased, the likelihood of someone skipping or delaying their care altogether increases as well, which certainly leads to less optimal health outcomes. And that's in no one's interest, least of all the person with CF. So those are just a few things.
Thanks, Mary. And Megan, what can we call on payers to do on the transparency side? How can we help patients make the most informed decision possible about their health insurance?
Excuse me. I think it's probably more of a pipe dream because there can't be, designated people at all payer offices that are going to walk through, and do that sort of case management with patients. But I mean, I would think a nice place for us to start would maybe just be the insurers, the payers being willing, the PBMs willing to come to the table and speak even with myself and Mary and the other groups all around the all the communities, because we did CHAMP and our partner HMPF, the Headache and Migraine Policy Forum, hosted and ICER participated, so thank you, hosted a meeting in November, and with the maybe naive intent that we would be able to get payers to come to the table and start to have this discussion with us. And just even figuring out, who the right person is, and being open to talking with the patient communities more, and explaining, maybe, breaking it down for the patients more, like what, who are all the players involved? Like, what is a PBM and how does it differ from a payer? And how about those, employer groups that are picking the plans, for employees? Like, how do we start those conversations with all of the people that need to be at the table? And I just wish that payers, it's like my plea, to payers, for them to be open and willing to come to that table and have those conversations, because it is in the best interest of everyone to talk about it in that more like holistic way around the cost of care, because you've got people specifically, people with migraine, a lot of them are going to end up in the ER because they are out of options, and many times because of the insurance barriers that are in place, then they're forced to go to the ER, which in fact, or in turn, actually costs the healthcare system more. So, you know, having those sort of I know they're difficult conversations, but just having them willing to come and start those conversations with us would be fantastic.
I echo that, Carl, but it's also a plug, a shameless plug for how critical patient group involvement is in each ICER report, and the ability to identify the major patient groups, what we heard from the patients and their families, what they wish the payer and manufacturer community knew about their condition. The number of payers who have commented to me personally about how valuable they find that section of the report, because short of a cultural and corporate commitment to create a whole patient engagement arm that will facilitate these types of conversations, for a lot of payers, especially on the mid and small size, this might be the only time they have an opportunity to hear from the patient community about the particular condition. So I'm not saying that's a sufficient substitute, but one that is available during an ICER review. The other thing, Mary, that you touched on that I also wanted to mention again is this idea of the original point of cost sharing was to discourage access to lower value care and encourage using higher value care. And it has somehow turned into, in many cases, not all, let's put the highest cost sharing burden, a 20% coinsurance on the most expensive drug for the person with the chronic condition who doesn't have a choice. And I just want to call on all of us to remember that health insurance is designed so that the people who are not currently sick are subsidizing care for the people who are sick. And when we do it upside down, I want us all to think about whether or not we're doing it right. All right, let's look at some questions from the audience. Use the Q&A function if there is anything that you wanted to have us address about this important topic of fair access. We did get a question about how is ICER planning to incorporate the increasing use of performance-based contracts, particularly for high-priced therapies? A really excellent question. That would really come through on the judgment of whether or not it's fairly priced. What ICER has been doing in some of its more recent analyses, especially in the cell and gene therapy space, is building into our baseline analysis of the fairness of the price any outcomes-based contract that the manufacturer has publicly committed to. So if, say, in the case of Zynteglo for beta thalassemia, Bluebird has said we're offering an 80% refund to the cost of the gene therapy if any patients at year 5 have to go back onto transfusions, we build that in to the model to say, then what is a fair upfront price? And so that's one way it'll be reflected in future analyses, is that outcomes-based contract, again, if it's been committed to by the manufacturer, would be there to say whether or not the price is fair. Whether or not there's other ways for us to look at outcomes-based contracts in terms of the prior auth and some of the eligibility criteria is a really excellent point that we will think about as a research team offline. So I appreciate that. All right, let's see what other questions have come in from the audience. I got a question about the 4/5 of PBMs who didn't publish their PA criteria. The answer is, when we talked to some of them, the answer was we do, it's just not branded as ours, because it's offered through a contract with a particular health plan. A prospective member might be able to find that information by visiting the website for, say, Cigna, as opposed to visiting the website for ESI. And so that was a distinction that was important for us to realize. And as we move forward with conducting any transparency analyses on that particular criteria, we might want to talk to some more PBMs and payers about how we can do a fair job of representing what happens when a prospective plan member is making a choice, because I think it's right that usually it's through the plan themselves, the health plan, and not that they know they're going to switch, say, from CVS to Optum as their PBM. So that's really important. All right, another call for questions in the Q&A. I see a question specifically a community where people are spending a lot of time and energy trying to get coverage for the new drugs in the space of ALS. We know that there's been approvals there. What can we do to help speed up the process with payers? I think that, and I would welcome both Mary and Meghan have had experience with new approvals for their communities and what it takes to sort of get the payer community to write new policies and give access. We know that a lot of payers and plans do things like put a hold for 6 months after an approval on any new any access at all while they adjudicate the evidence and negotiate with the manufacturer about formulary status and placement. And we can have a conversation about what that 6 months feels like to patients and is that fair, but I do know that that happens a lot in the community. And I think that the patient community can continue to give voice to what that looks like, especially in a disease area like ALS that hasn't had any effective treatments and has something new that they're excited about. What does it mean to make sure that there's quick access? So Meghan and Mary, let me turn to you. Meghan, anything from your community's perspective, advice on what to do during that period of a new approval and waiting for the coverage policies to be written?
Well, I think a couple of things. Don't be afraid to be persistent and loud and writing, letters to the insurers, to the payers. But also, I think I can't speak obviously for ALS, but at least within migraine, when all the new drugs were coming to market back in 2018, and then since, the manufacturers will often offer patient assistance type programs that make the drug accessible and affordable, to kind of cover that gap of 6 months to a year and even beyond. So perhaps maybe researching or looking into that aspect. And I mean, I wish I had better advice around the payer side of it and quickening them up or making them work more quickly. Unfortunately, we haven't had that experience either. So it was more of a long-term plan, I would say, with providing feedback and a lot of letter writing from the whole community, and getting on the call, getting on the line and trying to set up meetings with CMOs at some of the major payers to talk to them about the coverage and why aren't they covering it, and can we get that coverage sooner.
And one of the things that we do in our policy recommendations at the end of every review is call this out in particular: what makes sense, what seems fair based on the evidence in terms of getting policies written and applied. So I'd also call on patient groups to not be afraid of leveraging what ICER has said about fairness of policies in our individual reports and using that in your conversations with payers as well. Mary, anything to add on this one?
So piling on to Meghan in terms of advocacy and really encouraging folks to do that, including beforehand. I think what we saw challenges as with each new CF therapy, and especially the modulators coming out, was twofold. One, delay, right? It takes time to get it on a formulary. And two, which you speak to in the report, misconstruing clinical trial data for real world experience with a therapy. So always having to remember and remind payers sometimes that the circumstances of a clinical trial are not the totality of a patient population's experience. Clinical trials are, by their design, winnowing down a patient experience to sort of have the perfect patient within a certain frame. And in the case of cystic fibrosis, also often lung function, right? So patients would be excluded who had extremely high function, where you might not see much discrepancy or change in a new therapy, or low lung function. But the reality of these therapies is it's for everyone. And so those were really the two components that we saw frustration with payer decisions, both again, time and the complete picture of the disease. And so one thing that we did, knowing that a new therapy is coming down the pike, is really try to have conversations before decisions are made, even before the final approval of review. You have you have earlier data coming out, right, in the terms of what's reported from a phase 2, phase 3, and also what we had in CF, which I think something like ALS would have as well, is a very robust natural history. You know what the traditional trajectory of a disease is and where a new therapy may be more promising and why. So we were able to have conversations, not with every payer, there are far too many for us to be able to do that, although I wish we could, but really targeting some of the largest national payers, some of the largest Medicaids, to say, this is what we're seeing. This is what we're seeing in clinical trial evidence. This is why we're excited about it. Here's what you need to know. Here's how it might be applied in the real world and who this would be effective for. And importantly there, I think the other piece of advice I would say is bring not only the patient voice, but also the clinician voice, physician leaders of saying, this is how I would use this in my clinic, in my care team, was often a really effective tool and sort of a trusted voice for some of the chief medical officers to be able to have that peer-to-peer, if you would. So that's just some advice and experience. It's not always perfect, but really, as Meghan said, getting there and raising your voice and sharing your story about what this is really going to look like. And I think also, I think the other thing that the payers really want to know is for whom should this work, right? It's sometimes for everyone and sometimes it's not, and be able to explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate that point, Mary. I think that builds a lot of trust in the dialogue when there's an understanding of, we're not advocating that everybody, get this if that's what's clinically appropriate, right? We're advocating that it's available for this population. We know this is the population that would benefit the most. That's a great point. So we had a question in the chat about, was ICER able to look at the impact of copay accumulators in our analysis? And the answer is no. Because we did not see that anywhere in our analysis. We did include important stories from the patient community about the impact of them. But Mary, given the experience of your community with accumulators, I want to give you an opportunity to share about their impact and the lack of transparency there.
Yeah, this is a significant problem for anyone with chronic illness, and we're seeing it spell out right now in the cystic fibrosis community, unfortunately, to the detriment of far too many with CF. So I'll try to be quick because I know we're coming close to time. But before we explain what the heck an accumulator is, we need a basic understanding of the importance of copay assistance. And so I'll use CF as an example. For many cystic fibrosis treatments, drug manufacturers provide a coupon that a patient can use towards the cost of their prescription. Traditionally, those coupons are counted by their health insurance plan towards a person's yearly deductible and/or out-of-pocket maximums. And as I mentioned earlier, in terms of plan design, for many people with cystic fibrosis, they are often picking higher deductible plans because that is what covers the specialty care they require. So accumulators have really just thrown a giant wrench in this chain. And these programs are restrictions that an insurance company puts on counting copay assistance from that manufacturer towards a person's deductible and out-of-pocket maximum. So what it does for a person with cystic fibrosis is introduce new ongoing cost and extends the time that a patient needs to reach those financial limits of, again, deductibles and out-of-pockets. So it's placing additional cost on people with cystic fibrosis that they didn't have before. Listen, I think this is a symptom of a larger problem as health insurance plans and drug manufacturers jockey on how to manage a new era of highly effective therapies and expensive medications, in our case, CF modulators. These are life-altering treatments that have no value if the access is out of reach. And it's particularly harmful for patient populations who have no available alternatives to other therapies. What we know is for people with CF, and I think probably many other chronic illnesses, they rely on a patchwork of financial assistance from all kinds of sources to afford their medications and their care. And we know that this is just the latest in, Sarah, you said it, whack-a-mole, a long history of tug of war between insurers and manufacturers, and who's paying the price, literally, and carrying the burden is patients having to adapt to that change before another one props up with little to no reprieve. And really, Meghan, I appreciate everything you said. The patient has to be the center of the design of this system. And right now, unfortunately, they are not. So accumulators are bad. We oppose them. They again shift cost to patients. But if we don't step back and design a system that puts the patient first, chronic illness, and redesigning about how you pay for this care, the person with cystic fibrosis or migraine or ALS or what have you is going to continue to carry all of the burden. And that is in no one's interest.
I don't think we could sum it up any better. And so as we hit at the hour, my deepest gratitude to Mary and Meghan for spending time with us today and giving that important context to what it feels like to be a patient experiencing the variety of coverage policy choices made by payers, and the call to action that I think we all have, as we can talk about how it's a symptom of a problem and we can talk about it being a game of whack-a-mole, but at the end, we all need to remember we need a system designed to serve patients and their families for achieving the best health they can. Thank you all for your interest in ICER and its report. Again, my thanks to Mary and Meghan, and I hope everybody has a fantastic day. Thank you.
Thank you.